The sharp sound of the slap echoed through the gallery, followed by a deafening silence. The champagne glasses stopped clinking. The polite murmurs of appreciation died instantly, and dozens of eyes turned to watch my mother's hand leave a red mark on my cheek. "How dare you not mention me in your speech?" she hissed, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling with rage. "I gave you your artistic talent. I was the one who painted before you were born. My name is Emma Sullivan, and at 28, I was experiencing both the best and worst moment of my career simultaneously. My first solo exhibition, Shadows of Silence, had just opened at the prestigious Morton Gallery in downtown Seattle. The collection represented 3 years of work, countless sleepless nights, and every penny I'd saved from teaching art to elementary school kids. The irony wasn't lost on me. The exhibition centered around the theme of finding one's voice through art, and here I was being silenced at my own opening. My mother, Diana Sullivan, stood before me in her designer dress, her face contorted with the familiar mixture of disappointment and anger I'd grown up with. Behind her, my newest piece, Unspoken, seemed to mock the situation, a large canvas filled with mouths sewn shut with golden thread. I touched my cheek, feeling the sting of her hand, and 28 years of similar moments. The times she belittled my early drawings because they didn't match her artistic vision. The day she ripped up my college application to the Art Institute because real artists don't need school. The countless moments she'd introduced me as the daughter who also paints, but not like I used to. "Mrs. Sullivan." Marcus, the gallery owner, stepped forward, his usual calm demeanor showing cracks of concern. "This is highly inappropriate." But I held up my hand, stopping him. The gallery was silent, waiting for my reaction, for the drama to unfold. Instead, I simply picked up my small clutch from the nearby table, turned to Marcus, and said quietly, "I'm sorry, but I need to leave. Please make sure everyone enjoys the rest of the evening." "Emma, don't you dare walk away from me," my mother called out as I headed toward the exit. "I sacrificed everything for your art. I gave up my own career to raise you." The truth was, she'd given up painting long before I was born. Her last piece was created when she was 22, right before she married my father. She'd chosen a comfortable life with a wealthy businessman over pursuing her art, but somehow that had become my burden to bear. I pushed open the heavy gallery doors, stepping into the cool Seattle night. Behind me, I could hear Marcus attempting to salvage the situation, directing guests toward the open bar. My mother's voice carried through the doors, now playing the victim. "She's always been so dramatic, just like her father." I walked to my car, my heels clicking against the wet pavement. Inside, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. My phone started buzzing. First my mother, then my father, probably calling to tell me to apologize to her. I turned it off. Starting the engine, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. The red mark on my cheek was fading, but something in my eyes had changed. It was as if the last thread holding me to my mother's version of my life had finally snapped. I drove to my small studio apartment, the one my mother called beneath our family's status, the space that had witnessed the creation of every piece in tonight's exhibition. The walls were splashed with paint, canvases leaned against every surface, and in a corner stood my next project, a massive blank canvas I'd been saving for something special. Looking at it now, I knew exactly what it needed to become. My hands were already itching to pick up a brush, to transform this emptiness into something powerful. My mother had always painted pretty things, landscapes, flowers, tasteful portraits that matched people's furniture. She tried to force me into the same mold, to create acceptable art that would sell to her country club friends. But my art had always been different. Raw, uncomfortable, real. I changed out of my cocktail dress into paint-splattered overalls, pulled my hair into a messy bun, and stood before the blank canvas. The memory of tonight's humiliation, of every time she tried to dim my light, flowed through me. By sunrise, the first layer was complete, a chaos of colors and shapes that would make my mother cringe. But this was just the beginning. This piece would be different from anything I ever created. It would be bigger, bolder, and completely, unapologetically mine. My phone lay forgotten in my purse, probably filled with missed calls and messages. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care what my mother thought. I had something to say, and this time, I would say it with every brush stroke, every color, every inch of canvas. This wasn't just going to be a painting. It would be my declaration of independence. 6 months after the gallery incident, my life had transformed completely. I'd moved out of Seattle to a small coastal town called Port Haven, where I found an abandoned warehouse space for rent. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, took one look at my portfolio and offered me a deal I couldn't refuse. "This place has been empty for years," he'd said, gesturing to the high ceilings and massive windows. "Art belongs here. Make it live again." I poured everything into converting the warehouse into a working studio and gallery space. The rough concrete floors, exposed beams, and industrial lighting created the perfect backdrop for my new series. I called it Breaking Silence, each piece larger and more powerful than anything I'd done before. My mother's attempts to contact me had gradually decreased from daily calls to weekly messages, each one alternating between guilt trips and demands for an apology. I saved them all in a folder, not out of sentiment, but as fuel for my art. The local arts community in Port Haven embraced me with an openness that surprised me. Here, there were no expectations based on family name or social status. People stopped by the warehouse while I worked, bringing coffee or just sitting quietly, watching the pieces come to life. One morning, as I was working on the centerpiece of my new collection, I heard familiar footsteps behind me. It was Marcus from the Morton Gallery. "Your mother's been asking about you," he said, accepting the paint-stained mug of coffee I offered. "She came to the gallery last week, wanting to know if we'd heard from you." I continued painting, adding fierce strokes of red to the massive canvas before me. "And what did you tell her?" "The truth, that you're creating something extraordinary." He paused, studying the piece I was working on. "This is different, Emma, stronger. She's not going to like it." I stepped back, wiping my hands on my overalls. "That's the point." The piece I was working on stood 12 feet tall and 16 feet wide. It depicted a woman breaking free from golden chains, each link representing a different expectation, a different should that had been placed upon her. The figure's mouth was open in a silent scream that somehow seemed to echo through the entire warehouse. "I want to host your next exhibition," Marcus said suddenly. "The whole series, and I want to do it right." I turned to face him. "You know she'll come." "Yes, and this time, she'll have to see you for who you really are." Over the next few months, I threw myself into completing the collection. Each piece told part of the story, not just mine, but every artist who'd ever been told to be smaller, quieter, more palatable. The warehouse became my sanctuary, my place of truth. Word about my work spread through the art community. Critics who'd attended my first show started making the journey to Port Haven, writing about the transformation in my work. A prominent art blog featured my studio, describing it as a cathedral of rebellion, where silence is transformed into visual thunder. My father called once, his voice tired. "Your mother's not well, Emma. This situation is affecting her deeply." "You mean her reputation is affected?" I replied, not pausing in my work. "She misses you. She misses controlling me." He sighed. "The country club is hosting an art show next month. She's entering one of her old pieces. It would mean a lot if you came." I added another layer of gold to the chains in my painting. "I'm busy preparing for my own show." "Emma." "Goodbye, Dad." After I hung up, I stood before my latest piece, thinking about my mother's old paintings, safe, pretty things that matched her safe, pretty life. I remembered finding them in the attic when I was 12, dusty canvases of flowers and sunsets. Even then, I could sense the hesitation in her brush strokes, the dreams she'd abandoned for security. That evening, as the sunset painted the warehouse windows in shades of orange and pink, I started the final piece of my collection. It would be different from the others. Not an expression of anger or rebellion, but something deeper. Understanding, perhaps, or forgiveness. Not for her, but for myself. Frank stopped by with his usual evening coffee delivery, taking in the evolving piece. "You know," he said, settling into his usual spot on my paint-splattered couch, "sometimes the loudest statement you can make is showing someone who you've become without them." I looked at the invitation Marcus had sent me for the upcoming show. The opening was scheduled for exactly 1 year after my first exhibition. The one where my mother's slap had echoed through the gallery. The one where I'd walked away in silence. But this time, my art would do all the talking. The night of my second exhibition opening arrived with an electric energy that filled the Morton Gallery. This time, everything was different. My pieces dominated the space, their size and power transforming the usually elegant gallery into something raw and untamed. I stood in the center, wearing paint-splattered jeans and a simple black top. No more cocktail dresses or attempts to fit into my mother's vision of an artist. The crowd moved through the space in reverent silence, their whispers echoing off the massive canvases. Then I heard her gasp. My mother stood in the entrance, wearing one of her designer suits, her hand clutched to her chest. Her eyes moved from piece to piece, growing wider with each one. I watched as she took in the story they told. The golden chains, the sewn mouths, the breaking free. But it was the final piece that stopped her in her tracks. I titled it Echo. It showed two women painting, one confined within rigid, gilded frames, creating safe, pretty pictures, while the other broke through her canvas, her art spilling beyond boundaries in a glorious chaos of color. Their faces were mirror images of each other, separated by decades but bound by the same fears. "It's you," Marcus whispered beside me. "Both of you." My mother stepped closer to the painting, her hand reaching out but not quite touching the surface. For the first time in my life, I saw her fingers trembling not with anger, but with something else. Recognition, perhaps. "Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus said formally, "welcome to Emma's new collection." She didn't respond, still staring at Echo. I noticed she aged somehow in the past year, or maybe I was just seeing her clearly for the first time. The carefully maintained facade had cracks in it now. "The one in the frame," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "That's me." "It's both of us," I replied, speaking to her for the first time in a year. "It's who we were before we found our real voices." She turned to face me, and I braced myself for the familiar criticism. The cutting remarks about technique or subject matter, or how I was embarrassing the family name. Instead, tears slid down her perfectly made-up face. "I stopped painting because I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of not being perfect, of what people would say. And then I tried to make you into what I thought was safe." The gallery seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't the dramatic confrontation people might have expected. This was something quieter, more profound. "I know," I said simply. She looked around at my other pieces, really seeing them now. "You're so much braver than I ever was." I had to be. Every time you tried to make me smaller, my art had to grow bigger. A small crowd had gathered, watching our interaction, but for once, my mother didn't seem to notice or care about her audience. She walked slowly through the exhibition, stopping at each piece, her shoulders gradually losing their rigid posture. When she reached breaking silence, the centerpiece of the collection, she stood for a long time, just looking up at it. Finally, she turned to me. "I have something to show you," she said, opening her large handbag. She pulled out a small canvas, no bigger than a book. I started painting again after that night. The painting was rough, unpracticed, nothing like her old, polished works. It showed a small figure standing at a crossroads, surrounded by shadows. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was real, honest. "It's not very good," she said softly, "but it's true." I took the canvas from her hands, studying it. "This is the most beautiful thing you've ever painted." Frank, who had driven down from Port Haven for the opening, appeared at my side. "Sometimes," he said, his wise eyes twinkling, "we have to break apart to find our real selves." My mother looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not just for that night, but for every time I tried to silence your voice because I was afraid of my own." I handed her back her small canvas. "Keep painting," I said. "Not for anyone else. Just for you." She nodded, clutching the painting to her chest. Then, without warning, she hugged me. Not her usual stiff, social embrace, but something real and a little desperate. I felt her tears on my shoulder. The exhibition was a tremendous success. Critics praised the raw emotion, the technical skill, the fearless storytelling. But the real triumph wasn't in the reviews or sales. It was in the small canvas that appeared at my warehouse studio a week later. Another painting by my mother, this one larger, bolder. Attached was a note, teaching myself to be brave. "Thank you for showing me how." I hung it on my wall, right next to my first childhood drawing, the one she'd once called messy and wrong. Together, they told a story of breaking free, of finding voice, of healing. Not through words, but through art. Just as it should be.